Well, ladies and gentlemen, in this video we are going to be discussing the former home of football in the city of Perth in Western Australia. That is, of course, Subiaco Oval. We are going to be taking a look back at the stadium and some of its unique features as well as the history of the ground. Now, it did open all the way back in 1908 and it was initially home of the Subiaco Football Club in the Waffle. And really at this point it was a typical suburban ground, but throughout the 1930s, it did become the main stadium in Perth, where it did host the Waffle Grand Finals, any state of origin representative matches, etc. And it did start seriously being developed in 1969, where they did construct the three-tier stand behind one of the goals at the Subiaco end. And it was quite unique in the fact that normally the biggest stand is built on the wing, but they did actually construct this stand behind the goals, and it did give the stadium a very unique look at that point in time before they developed the rest of the ground. And at this point in time, that was when the stadium was at its biggest capacity. Obviously, back in those days, they did have a lot of terraces and standing room areas, and they weren't as strict in terms of the occupational health and safety, so they did pack people in. The record attendance was recorded in the 1979 Waffle Grand Final between East Fremantle and South Fremantle of 52,781. In 1981, they did continue the development of the ground where they built the two-tiered members stand on the wing that was on the broadcast side of the ground as you look at it on TV. And as we know, 6 years later, the Eagles did enter the AFL in 1987. And when the Eagles did come into the AFL, actually about 2/3 of the ground was still fairly undeveloped. You did have those exposed terraces on the outer wing and also behind the goals at the city end. And then you did have a few older grandstands on the broadcast side of the ground. In 1995, when Fremantle came into the competition, they did build a stand on the outer wing with a lot of the corporate boxes and also the video screens. It is quite a small stand and doesn't really hold too many people. But if you're familiar with the orientation of the ground, it was backed right up onto a road, sort of like the Hickey stand in Geelong. So they couldn't go too big with the build on that side of the ground. In 1997, they did install the light towers so they could start playing night matches at the ground. Previously, they did have to play night games at the Wacker, which did have its light towers installed much earlier. But that ground had a much smaller capacity, and by this point they'd really gone with Subiaco as the home of AFL football. However, they did continue to play AFL games at the Wacker all the way up to the year 2000, which was an interesting decision. I'm not sure why they didn't move all the night games to Subiaco at that point when they did install the light towers in 1997, but it did make for some interesting viewing at that point in time. And really the final major redevelopment did occur in 1999, where they did build the two-tiered stand behind the goals at the city end of the ground. Previously that was a terrace with standing room, and they tried to make that stand look as similar as possible to the existing members stand from ground level, but it actually was constructed much later. That development also brought the stadium into the modern age in terms of becoming an all-seater stadium, so no more significant standing room areas. The capacity after the final development was 43,500, and that is the way the stadium remained until its demolition. And in its final form, it was a slightly weird looking stadium. You did have a bit of a mishmash of different stands, going from the one-tiered stand on the outer wing to the three-tiered stand behind the goals. So it was definitely a unique stadium in that format. And it was quite funny when you did contrast some of the newer parts of the ground to the two-tiered member stand that was built in 1981. It did actually retain the wooden bench seating all the way up until its demolition, which was certainly unique in the AFL at that point in time. Now, the stadium was also the training and administrative base for the West Coast Eagles, so they did get the advantage of training on the ground that they did play at every second week. And another unique aspect of the stadium was how long the actual ground was. It was 175 metres from goal to goal, which was easily the longest in the AFL. And you can sort of see by the perspective you get when you look at the gap between the 50-metre line and the centre square in terms of how long the ground actually was. You can see there's a massive gap between those two lines. Now, the ground also ran east to west, which is somewhat unique. Normally stadiums are orientated north to south, so you don't get the harsh light at the end of the day. And when you were sitting at the city end of the ground on the eastern side looking west, you did get some really harsh glare in terms of the sunset as the sun went down behind that three-tiered stand, which wasn't an ideal situation for the fans. The ground was known as having a big home ground advantage, particularly in the 2000s for the home teams, and especially the Eagles. They were almost unbeatable over there. They would regularly put teams away by 10 goals plus, even good opposition teams from interstate. And the stadium was known as the House of Pain in that time because of how difficult it was to play at for opposing teams. And the stadium did actually have a good atmosphere. Despite only having a capacity of just over 40,000 people, it did get really loud in that place. And that has been a little bit of a criticism when it comes to the new stadium in Perth, Optus Stadium. Despite being much bigger, you could argue the crowd atmosphere isn't quite as good as Subiaco. Now, even though the final stage of the redevelopment was completed in 1999, by the mid-2000s it had become pretty obvious that the stadium was obsolete by modern standards. You did have some really horrible facilities. The concourses were very tight. It was very hard to get around the ground. It was a very ugly stadium, particularly from the outside. And it was also located in a residential neighbourhood, which made it very difficult for large volumes of people to get in and out of the ground at the same time. You did have some suburban railway stations that did service the ground, but they really weren't geared up for major events. And all in all, through the 2000s, it probably became the worst of the full-time AFL grounds, at least in the major capital cities. And there was plenty of dialogue in Perth about the need for either a big redevelopment or a new stadium at that point in time. There was a proposal to renovate it into a 60,000 seat stadium. We did get some drawings or renderings or whatever you want to call it at the time. These were just impressions. They weren't the final design or anything like that. But even if you redeveloped this ground, even if you completely demolished it and rebuilt it, you would be dealing with the problem that it is located in a residential neighbourhood and there isn't enough space around the ground for those large crowds of people to congregate and move in and out of the ground. And ultimately the decision was made to build Optus Stadium on the Burswood Peninsula, a brand new world-class 60,000 seat stadium for the city of Perth. And you'd have to say it's been a great thing for the city of Perth. You do have a much bigger capacity. It is a lot easier to get tickets. It was very difficult to actually get tickets at Subiaco if you weren't a member, because they sold almost 95% of the seats to members. And all in all, the move to Optus Stadium has been a great thing for the city of Perth. It is a much better location, much bigger capacity. You do lure the world-class events in terms of the concerts, the European soccer when they do come to Australia, international rugby games, etc. And it really revitalised the city of Perth in a lot of ways. Construction of Optus Stadium began in 2014 and it was completed in late 2017. And the last AFL season to be played at Subiaco Oval was the year 2017. And 2 years later, the stadium was demolished, where they did turn it into a public oval. The actual ground is still there, but they've just removed all the stands around it. They did also build a school next to where the stadium was located. And the school utilises the oval as their playing fields. And they did retain some of the original gates to the ground which were heritage listed. So it is a nice touch and it ensures that Subiaco Oval will never be forgotten. Either way guys, that is going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching and don't forget to subscribe for more.